Hi, I'm Bruce Bonebrake. Welcome to this installment of the AutoZone Do-It-Yourself video series. Your vehicle is an important investment, and doing your own maintenance and repairs is a great way to protect that investment. It is our goal to take the mystery out of the common automotive repairs that you're likely to run into from time to time. We'll guide you step by step through the procedures necessary for doing the jobs yourself. This will also make it possible for you to save money in the process. No doubt about it, as the reliability and sophistication of our cars has gotten better through the years, so has the quality of the ride. Even the slow pace could not help the ride quality experienced by our great-grandparents, especially on a bumpy road. By the mid-20th century, things finally began to improve. Until now, we had hardly noticed the road at all, and it takes a good-sized bump to get our attention. For the first few decades, car suspensions had nothing but the same leaf springs as those used by carriages. As speeds increased, so did the number of accidents. The reason for this is due to the way the springs work. When a compressed spring is released, it expands to return to its original state. When the spring is compressed quickly, which is what happens when a car hits a bump, the spring expands faster and goes past its normal height. Weight on the spring causes it to compress again, starting the cycle over. The process happens over and over, with the spring compressing and expanding a little less each time until the movement finally stops. Besides contributing to a rather bouncy ride, the actions of springs could also cause the wheels to leave the road momentarily or for the car to lean too far when turning a corner, either of which might result in a loss of control. It became clear that a smooth ride wasn't simply a matter of comfort, but also of safety, and that the most important job of the suspension was to keep the car on the road. Shock absorbers dampen the movement of the springs by applying force in the opposite direction of their travel, thereby slowing the motion. Shocks control motion equally as well, whether the spring is expanding or contracting, resulting in a ride that's less bouncy, and more importantly, the tires remaining on the ground. Now, I have one good example of a shock absorber right here. This is basically what it looks like. One end is going to be attached to one end of the suspension, the other would be attached to the other end of the suspension. And it's designed to absorb the shock. Now, this shock, for example, is gas charged. You can see how it's retracting itself back out. Now, this shock's still used today on many applications. If you have like a leaf spring suspension or a torsion bar type suspension, you're going to see the shock absorber being used. But more and more, this is what's found on most vehicles. This is called a strut. Now, the difference between a shock and a strut, not only is this the shock, it also has a spring, like this example. You can see the complete assembly. This is the shock-spring combination. So basically, instead of having a separate shock and spring, this is the complete unit. Now, this would mount on a front-wheel drive portion of the car. Not only is this the shock and a spring, this is also a key component to the suspension because the upper mount would actually take the place of the upper control arm and the upper ball joint. This mounts to the body of the vehicle. Now, this is a rear strut, and if you look at this compared to our assembled unit, you'll see that it doesn't come with the spring and it doesn't come with the upper mount. You can just buy the replacement cartridge. Now, another thing to notice between a front and a rear strut, you can see that it's quite a bit smaller on this application. Now, more and more applications out there are having the complete unit available. The nice thing about the complete unit is after a period of time, you're going to have some spring sag. So when you do the replacement, you're replacing the whole assembly, not only the shock portion or the strut, but also the spring. But still, on your application, if the only thing that's available would be the replacement strut, it's just a matter of taking the strut apart and transferring the spring. Now, the shocks can come in different variety. For example, you might have like the standard duty or a medium or a heavy duty. On a rear shock or front shock, if it has shocks on the front, you might even be able to get it like with a spring assist, or it would be like an overload application like pulling a trailer. They even have the air adjustable shocks. Now, let's talk again about the shocks, whatever happens when you have a problem with it, or the strut. Apart from keeping the tires firmly on the road and the vehicle from leaning too far in a turn, having shocks and struts that are in good condition is vital to your safety. Worn shock absorbers can lead to longer stopping distances due to the reduced braking efficiency and the increased risk of skidding on wet pavement. Defective shocks also increase operating costs because of tire wear, poorer gas mileage, and higher maintenance costs on other suspension and steering components. Our first example, we have a 1999 Plymouth Voyager. It has 131,000 miles on it. The back shocks, we're going to replace them. It's time. Our second vehicle, we have a 1996 Nissan Maxima, and we got a noise in the front, and we know it's coming from the strut. Shocks should be part of your normal maintenance. When you get to a certain mileage interval, just go ahead and replace the shock. That's something to keep in mind. You don't want to wait until the shocks fail. You want to replace them ahead of time. There are some things to look for that can alert you when it's time to replace the shocks.
When driving, excessive bouncing, swaying when cornering, or a tendency for the nose of the vehicle to dive when coming to a stop are all indicators. If a shock binds internally, it can cause the ride to seem stiff. Uneven wear or flat spots on tires is often caused by worn shocks. Also inspect the shocks occasionally for signs of leaking.
While sophisticated electronic equipment has been developed to test shocks, a simple bounce test is still a good way to tell if shocks and struts might need to be replaced. To do a bounce test, push down on a fender to rock the vehicle up and down several times, then release it. The suspension should settle back down after bouncing no more than once. If it rocks up and down more than once, the shock or strut may be bad. If a knocking noise is heard during the test, the shock absorber could have a loose piston, worn piston shaft bushing, or worn mounting bushings. Well, the next thing to do now is get started on our vehicles.
As with any job, to do it right, you'll need the right tools. The nice thing is that jobs we'll be covering today don't require a large, expensive assortment. Basic hand tools are generally all you'll need. In case where a specialty tool is required, be sure to check with AutoZone's Loan a Tool program. They have many specialty tools that can help you complete your job a lot quicker and easier. The first things you'll need are a socket set, torque wrench, drop light, and a repair manual for your specific vehicle. You may also need screwdrivers or pliers to remove some components. To get under the vehicle, you'll need a good jack, some wheel blocks, and some sturdy jack stands. Finally, a good supply of oil dry, an assortment of rags, and a quality hand cleaner are must-have items for easy cleanup after the job is finished.
Get in the zone, AutoZone.
When lifting a vehicle, never work under it until it has been secured with wheel blocks and securely positioned on jack stands. A hydraulic jack alone is never enough. And always remember to wear your safety glasses.
Okay, we're getting ready to install the rear shocks on our Plymouth Voyager. The first thing we want to do, though, we're going to take the hubcap off and loosen the lug nuts while the vehicle is still on the ground. We'll go and do that on both sides. Then we can go and raise the vehicle up, and then we'll support it with jack stands. I'll place the jack on the center of the axle. That'll raise the whole back end of the vehicle. Place the jack stands underneath the axle. It doesn't have to go very high. And then lower our jack. Whenever you're working on the suspension, a couple things to keep in mind is one is you want to locate where the spring is and also what kind of task you're going to perform. Like in our case, we're going to replace the shock absorber, which is basically located right here. We have a leaf spring rear suspension on our Voyager, so we want to place the jack stands directly underneath the axle to support it. If this was like a strut style suspension, we'd want to let that hang. So you want to locate what kind of suspension you have and then go ahead and place the stands accordingly. The very first thing we want to do is we want to spray down both the fasteners that hold the shock onto the van, and we'll take some penetrating oil and spray it down real well. And then after we spray down, let it soak for just a minute, we can go and take the fasteners off, take the shock off, then we'll be ready to put the new one on. Remove the wire that keeps the new shock compressed for shipping. When mounting the new shock absorber, be sure not to get any grease on the bushings or any other nearby part. Install the upper nut and the washer. Don't get it real tight, just get it snug. Well, now that I have the top of the shock secured, I don't have it all the way tight yet, not until I get the bottom bolt in place. But because this is a gas-charged shock, I'm going to have to compress it, then line the bolt up with the hole. One thing to keep in mind with that is just make sure you don't cross-thread the bolt when you start it. It should turn easily. There we are. Now both fasteners can be tightened down tight. Okay. Well, the shock is installed on this side. We'll go ahead and put the wheel and tire back on. We'll go over to the other side and repeat the process. All right. That pretty much takes care of the rear shocks on our Voyager. I still need to drop it down off the jack stands and torque the lug nuts. Next up, we're going to pull our Maxima in. We're going to replace the front struts on it. It's a little bit more involved, but we'll get into that as we go along. Here's a strut assembly on the passenger side, and if you look at it, it's pretty simple to take this out of the car. We have two bolts and nuts on the lower mount. We'll take both those loose. We need to take the clip loose that secures the brake hose to the strut assembly. Then on top we have the upper strut mount, and it's held in place with 3 nuts. Before we actually take the nuts loose on that, we want to make an alignment mark on one of the studs according to the body so we can put it back in the same way. Let's go ahead and get started. Yeah, that's where a breaker bar really comes in handy. Sometimes those bolts can really be tight. One more tip I want to give you before we actually take this apart. On some vehicles, this is actually one of the alignment adjustment areas, these 2 bolts right here. Sometimes you'll see a cam on one of the bolts, and that's actually where you set the alignment. On other vehicles, it'll have like one hole that'll be slotted, and you still do the alignment adjustment there, but there'll be no external cam. Until we actually take the bolts out of there, we don't really know what we have here. So a good tip, before we actually take it all the way loose, is take a can of spray paint and just spray the outline of the strut, so that when we put the new strut in place, we'll know exactly where it goes. We'll still need to do a wheel alignment after we're all done, but that'll get us pretty much in the ballpark. Let's go ahead and spray our mark. Well, that takes care of the bottom of the strut. Now we need to go underneath the hood and take the 3 nuts loose on the upper strut mount. Well, here's our upper strut mount right here. We have the 3 nuts that attach the strut to the body of the car. Something else you may want to do at this point too before you take this off is go ahead and mark the location of one of the studs. I'm just going to use a marker and mark the stud itself, and then mark the body of the car so I know where that stud went. That'll make it a lot easier on the install because some of the upper mounts may be directional where they need to go in a certain way. Okay, let's go ahead and take the nuts off and drop the strut out. Now on this last nut, before you take it all the way off, you want to get your hand underneath there and just secure the strut so it doesn't just fall out. Well, that's our old strut. It's time to take it over to the vise and we can disassemble it. Okay, with our old strut assembly, what we need to do next, we need to compress the coil spring and remove it from the old strut, then we'll put it onto the new strut. In order to do that, you want to make sure you have it secured in a fixture. We have a vise here that has the V-shaped jaws on it. I'm going to go ahead and put a shop towel on both of the jaws to protect the strut. And then we're basically going to put the body of the strut in the V-shaped jaws and tighten it down. Now when you go to tighten this down, you don't want to over-tighten it. If you do, well, it doesn't make much difference on the old strut. But on the new strut, you don't want to damage the housing of the strut or you've destroyed it. Let's go ahead and spin it down. And make sure it's secure. Right there, feels pretty good. There we are, it's locked in place now. Okay, now here's the coil spring. In order to compress this, we have a coil spring compressor. And what it basically is, it's 2 fixtures. They're going to go on both sides of the coil spring 180 degrees apart. And as we tighten both of these up, it's going to compress the spring. The first step on this, we want to go ahead and oil the threads. Let's take some spray lubricant. What we want to do is just spray the lubricant on the threads. The reason for that is it's going to take a lot of force to compress that spring, to stop our threads from binding, make the process a little bit easier. Here we are. Okay, now if you look at the fixtures, they actually have a locking device here. Once this goes into the coil of the spring, push the locking device there, that'll capture the spring inside of here so it can't come off. One thing to keep in mind is safety is really key here. Just take your time. If it looks like it's not compressing evenly, just go ahead and let it off and try it again. There's no sense in getting in a hurry. Let's go ahead and get started. That looks like that's the best place for our spring compressor. Both of the compressors have to be 180 degrees apart from each other. You don't want to have them close together like this. If you do, when they go to tighten up, it's going to want to bulge the spring. The way I've placed this is I need to be able to get my socket for my impact wrench. There's a flat right here, and there's a flat across from there on the other side, so that's really the only place to install them. What I want to do now is I'm going to go ahead and rotate the strut. I'm just going to rotate it up, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to kind of go back and forth between the two bolts with the impact, because I want to put even pressure on them. I don't want to tighten one down a lot tighter than the other. If I do, the same thing's going to happen. It's going to want to bulge on us. Okay, everything's all set. One last look. Something else to keep in mind too, you want to try to keep the compressor straight. You don't want it cocked on the spring. Let's go ahead and start compressing the spring. Okay, this is what we're looking for right here. When you have it to the point that the spring is free inside the strut, that we've got it compressed enough. Now, something to keep in mind, once we take the top shaft nut off the strut, you want to make sure and be very careful while you're handling this compressed spring, because we actually need to pull it off the body of this, set it away, keep it away from your face. Don't drop it. If you can, then there's a good chance that it could come apart, and we don't want that. So we're going to take the nut off, take our upper mount off, slide the spring off, and then we'll go ahead and install the new strut in place. There's our upper mount. Something else too, we want to kind of look at the upper mount assembly, make sure that there's no cracks in the rubber or it's deteriorated. Now if it was, the nice thing about that is this is a replaceable part. This doesn't come with the strut, but you can replace the upper mount assembly. Ours looks like it's in pretty good shape. Something else too, we have a shim in here, this factory shim. We want to make sure this goes back into place. Even if we're going to use the new strut mount, you'd want to transfer this over to the new mount. Well, that looks good. Now this is the bearing. This is below the upper mount. This is actually a little roller bearing assembly that actually turns as the strut turns. This is another replaceable part. Ours feels like it's in really good shape. Yeah, the upper spring seat was in kind of a bind with our puller. Just be careful when you're working around this compressed spring. You don't want to take a chance of dislodging anything. Now, this is the upper spring seat. Now, again, what you're looking for is any kind of damage on this rubber insulation. As a matter of fact, you can see the mark where the upper spring pigtail was. We want to make sure we place the spring in that exact location. But if you do look at this, I do see a problem. If you look right here, see how this is ripped out. This is the upper bumper. I'm going to pop that out of there. There we go. There's the upper bumper. That is, I'm going to get the spring out of the way. And like I say again, just make sure you keep this away from your eyes. Set it away. And be very careful with it. Okay? Now, if you look at this, this is a mess. You can see that the plastic, the rubber is deteriorated. It's came all apart. This actually has two purposes. One is it's a shield to keep the debris away from the shaft, so there's no chance of it getting into the shaft seal area and actually wear this out and cause the strut to leak. Something else it is too, it's also a bumper on the very top, and that's actually what's ripped apart here, the bumper section of this. Another good thing is they do make the replacement, and there it is. It even has a little bit heavier duty style bumper on it, but that basically is going to go onto our new strut. So any parts that you see along the way, you can go ahead and get the replacement. When you buy the replacement strut, this is basically what you're going to get. As a matter of fact, I want to compare the old one to the new one. Take it out of our vise. Okay, here we are. There's the new strut. There's the old strut. And if you look at them, what you're looking for, to make sure that the spring plate looks the same, make sure the mount looks the same. Now there is a left and a right, and what that difference would be is the location of that brake hose tab. Something else too, this is even marked. It might be kind of hard to see because it's in black here, but it says right hand right on the strut. Another nice feature on the new compared to the original strut, if you look at the mounting holes where it mounts onto the spindle, we have our pre-drilled hole on the top, and on the bottom you can see that it's slotted. And that's nice. If you get it to the alignment shop, that'll give it even more adjustment to the wheel alignment. Let's go ahead and mount the new strut in our vise. We'll get rid of the old one. And we're ready to do the reassembly process. Something else to note too is on the spring compressor, that's not a part you really have to actually go out and buy. AutoZone has that available in their stores in the Loan a Tool program. For a refundable deposit, they'll let you borrow the tool, you get done with it, and bring it back to the store. They'll give you your deposit back, which is a nice feature. We need to make sure we have this located in about the same spot. Remember, we had the two flat areas that we wanted to have our compressor set up at. Turn it a little bit farther, and it should be somewhere right in there. Let's go ahead and put this into place. Now, before we get the spring over here, we've got a couple things we want to do. As you can see, the shipping of the strut assembly, to make the box smaller, they've got it compressed and they've got it held in place with a clip. To release that, just push in. And it is gas charged, so it's going to make the piston come right out. You can just discard this clip. Okay, now on the bumpers, there's two different styles. If you look at this, we've got the one, this would be for the rear, and this would be for the front. There's a difference in the diameter and also the style of the bumper. Let's go ahead and put the one for the front on. Okay, it's in place. Okay, now we're ready to go ahead and put the spring back in place. And one thing to keep in mind on the spring is there is a spot here where the pigtail goes onto the strut. You can see where it's got a bulge right there. You want to make sure you line that in the right place. Something else too to keep in mind is also the rubber insulation that's actually on the pigtail of the spring. You want to make sure that's in good shape. If it's not, you'd want to replace that. That might cause a squeak as this operates. Place the spring back over the strut, line up the pigtail. Just kind of let it fall into place for a second. Now, the next part we want to put on there is the upper spring plate. And like I said, again, you can see where the pigtail was. So that'll be the alignment of it. Okay, we've got the upper seat lined, we've got the lower seat lined, our dust boot is snapped into place. We're just going to let that drop down a minute. Okay, next we're ready for our bearing, and we mentioned that our bearing's in good shape, but I'll tell you what, it is now, but what about 30, 35,000 miles down the road if this little part would fail, you're taking this all back apart again. So this would be a good time to go ahead and check into replacing the bearing, and we're also going to replace the upper mount. Let's go ahead and reassemble the top of it. Now on the bearing, there is a top and a bottom if you look at this. On the bottom side, or facing the upper spring plate, you're going to see how there's no ridge on it. But on the top, we do have a ridge. That's going to face up. Let's go ahead and install it. On our upper strut mount, if you look at this, remember we talked about the shim. Let's go ahead and remove that. It's basically just a piece of cardboard. You can see how it has a crack in it, but that really doesn't matter. It's just a spacer. And then this is the piece we're going to replace. That's where the rubber mount is actually located inside of that. The same thing here. Even though ours is in good shape, it's not torn up at all, no cracks in it. What about 30, 35,000 miles down the road, and you have to go back in and replace this? So we're going to take our new one, and there is only one way it can actually go on here. There, just like that. The same thing with our shim. Drop it back into place. Now this can be reinstalled. Now at the very top of our strut we had the nut. Now if you look at this, there's our old nut. Now this is a nylon style lock nut. You see the nylon coming out of it. You want to discard that and use the packaged nut that comes with your strut. You look at it, it's a little bit different style naturally, but this one doesn't have the nylon in it, because if you try reusing this, it'll never stay tight because there's no lock effect to it anymore. Okay. Okay, we have a lot of parts to hold together at one time here in order to put our nut on the end of the strut. There's one trick right here. We'll make sure we have the pigtail, or the lower pigtail of the spring, aligned to the strut where it needs to go. Just take a pair of vice grips, and what we're going to do, we don't over tighten it, we want to adjust it so it holds it fairly snug. And make sure we keep it away from our spring compressor, because we're going to have to release that. There, that'll be perfect. Now we don't want to really distort the strut. It's a little too tight. Right there, that's perfect. Okay, I've got it all in place. Now at this point, you should be looking at this much of the shaft coming out of the end of the upper spring plate. If you're not, go back and check your assembly. Make sure that the rubber bumper and our dust boot and everything's in place. We want to go ahead and put our upper bearing on it, the upper mount on it, and then put our nut on it. Then we go ahead and tighten our nut down. Okay, the upper strut mount's tight. Now the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and loosen up our spring compressor. And the same way we tighten it, you want to just do it alternate from one to the other. You want to just release it evenly. For right now, I'm going to go ahead and leave the vice grips in place just to hold everything in place. And that's one last thing you want to do before you start releasing the spring. Just double check your alignment of the bottom and the upper pigtails to make sure they're in the same location and they look good. So let's go ahead and release our compressor. Okay, go ahead and release our vice grips. Push our pins back. And there it is, the complete assembly. Let's go put it back on the car. Well, the upper strut mount is in place, and I've got our alignment stud in the right location. For right now, just have the nuts on there finger tight, and that'll help line up the bottom of the strut to the spindle. Let's go ahead and do that next. Okay, we have the bottom of the strut in place, and the bolts are also finger tight down here on the bottom. What I want to do now is go back on top, and I want to torque them down to specification. Then I'll come down here and do the same thing to the lower bolts. Before we tighten this all the way, there's one thing to remember. Remember, we painted our mark on there. It's a good thing we did, too, because the new strut, if you remember how the hole was elongated on the bottom there, and here's what it does. You can see how much movement I have there, and that's going to really help for the wheel alignment on this vehicle, so that's an improvement. But the initial setting on this, in order to get the car to the alignment shop, I have to be pretty close to where it was originally. That's where our paint mark is going to come into play. What I want to do is I want to adjust it. As a matter of fact, about right there is where I want to tighten it up. Now I can go ahead and torque it to specification. Now the torque specifications required for this job are going to be found in your repair manual. Well, the last thing we need to do on this job is go ahead and reattach our brake hose to the strut. Okay. Well, we've got the brake hose on. Next thing we'll do is go ahead and pick up our tools, put the wheel on, and then it's off to the other side. Now the driver's side is going to come apart basically the same way the passenger side did. Very first thing I do is mark the top of the strut, so we have the alignment mark. Then I go down below and mark the bottom, take the strut out, and then we can go ahead and compress it and put the new strut together.
the ride from the alignment shop was smooth and the car handled like new. Shocks and struts age gradually, and it might not be easy to notice until they're worn out. When it's time to replace yours, remember that the folks down at AutoZone will help you get the right parts, products, and the tools you need to do the job right the first time. Thanks for watching. I'm Bruce Bonebrake.